Thank you, Benno, for your introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here at the Free University. The last time I was here to give a lecture was in 1984. It's good to be back again. But today I want to talk about the topic, did science kill God? Many people believe that in this modern scientific age, that belief in God is no longer justifiable. And so that's the question I want to discuss. Is God dead? There are many books that have been written that argue that's the case. Richard Dawkins, you may have heard of. Steve Bruce, God is Dead, Secularization in the West. Victor Stenger, God and the Folly of Faith. Christopher Hitchens, God is Not Great. Sam Harris, The End of Faith. And there's more books written in this vein, and they all have the same idea that we can no longer believe in God, that science has shown that God is irrelevant. So Victor Stenger, for example, another book, writes, no God has designed the world. Everything whose origins have been understood so far has arisen by simple natural processes. No God has given us immortal souls. Everything suggests that our minds are entirely reducible to simple material components. And no God has made any miraculous interventions in human history. All such accounts are unreliable. Now, Richard Dawkins believes that it was biology that killed God. He writes that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Before Darwin, atheists had difficulty explaining how everything came to be. Dawkins believed that Darwin showed how life could arise from non-life and how it could develop into human beings. And Dawkins also writes that faith is belief in spite of the lack of evidence. He believes that Christians might believe in God, but they have no evidence for that. In fact, that all the evidence is against it. Hawking, famous physicist, believes that physics killed God. In his book, The Grand Design, he writes, physics can explain everything, so we don't need a God to create the world. Beforehand, people believed in God because they weren't aware of how nature operated. Now we know how nature works, and we don't need God anymore. So Victor Stenger talks about faith and evidence. He writes, faith is always foolish. It leads to many evils. Faith is belief in the absence of supportive evidence. The same idea that Dawkins has. He makes two claims. The first claim is that to be rational, the belief must be supported by sufficient evidence. The second claim is that belief in God is not supported by sufficient evidence. Therefore, belief in God is irrational. Those claims, first of all, that science can explain everything, so we don't need God to explain the world. Secondly, physical laws leave no room for miracles. So when the Bible speaks about miracles, the Bible must be wrong. And finally, that there is no evidence for God, so belief in God is irrational and delusional. But the counter against that, when we look at belief and evidence for belief, we have to recognize, first of all, that we believe many things without evidence. For example, look around this room, and I see 2, 4, 6, I see 10 people. What's the evidence for that? Well, I just see it. It's a basic sort of thing. Okay, so belief has to start somewhere. You can try explaining things, but there has to be a ground basis of something that you just have to accept as a fact. So it could be that belief in God is such a basic belief that we're made in such a way so that the evidence of God immediately strikes us so that we don't need evidence. It's a basic belief. Secondly, you have to remember that a fact counts as evidence for a belief only after we interpret that fact in terms of a framework or a worldview. And depending on what worldview you have, you're going to have a different assessment of whether a fact is evidence for something or not. Look at the claims that these people make against religion. They say that everything can be explained by science without God, that miracles never happened, that they can never happen, and that there is no evidence for God. Now, if you look at these three claims, you should ask yourself, what is the evidence that supports these claims? First one, everything can be explained by God. Well, how do you know? The evidence has explained, or science has explained some things, but there are many things that are still unexplained by science. So to say that science can explain everything is a belief that doesn't really have sufficient evidence. How do you know miracles never happened? But that they can't happen. Again, you can't prove that. You don't have evidence for that, but it's something that you accept on the basis of faith. And thirdly, how do you know there's no evidence for God? Many people claim to have encountered God. And many people claim to have experienced miracles, answers to prayers, things of that nature. So what that means is that all three of these claims are really claims that are made without sufficient evidence. Chesterton is an interesting English author. About 100 years ago, he wrote, "An extraordinary idea has arisen that the disbelievers in miracles consider them coldly and unfairly, while believers in miracles accept them only in connection with some dogma." But the fact is quite the other way. Believers in miracles accept them because they have evidence for them. The disbelievers in miracles deny them because they have a doctrine against them. So here again, what Chesterton points out is that what you accept as evidence depends upon how you interpret the facts on your worldview presuppositions. So we have to ask the question, is science really objective? It's often claimed to be. So the myth is that science is factual, objective, and rational, whereas on the other hand, once you look at religion, religion is something that's mythical, subjective, and irrational. Now, if you accept these descriptions of science and religion, then in any encounter, science will always win and religion will lose. The difficulty is that once you look more closely at science, the reality is that science has both objective and subjective aspects. The science we have to distinguish on the one hand between the hard facts, the things that we actually see. Okay, they can be quite objective. Everybody can see the same things. You can check out the data for yourself. On the other hand, you have theories that try to explain the data, but the theories can be very subjective. So for example, if you look at galaxies, so astronomy, which is my field of research, if you look at the galaxies, and these are all galaxies in this picture here, the galaxies are all shifted towards the red, if you look very closely at their light. Now what causes the redshift? So everybody agrees on the data, but there's various explanations. The most popular explanation is that space is expanding. But another explanation is that actually the galaxies are moving through space, but space is standing still. A third explanation is that there's a large mass at the other end of the universe that has a gravitational attraction on the galaxies, and that would cause a redshift. Or maybe the speed of light has decreased in the past, that would cause a redshift as well. Maybe instead of the universe expanding, we're shrinking, and the atoms getting smaller. Or maybe light just gets tired as it's traveled. As it travels further, it gets more tired, and as it gets more tired, it loses energy and it shifts towards the red. Now, all of these explanations you'll find in the literature. The question is, which one of these is the correct explanation? So how do you choose which theory is correct? Or consider quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, if you look at an atom, a radioactive atom, it can explode at some point, and it's impossible for us to say exactly when that's going to happen. So here we have the same theory. The equations are exactly the same, quantum mechanics, but you have many different interpretations. One popular explanation is that nature itself is random. So that means that not even God knows when this atom is going to explode. Another interpretation is that mind creates reality. That you have the equation of quantum mechanics. We have the wave function, but to collapse the wave function, you need consciousness. Or another explanation is that the world splits into multiple worlds each time you have a nuclear reaction. A fourth is that your mind splits every time you have an interaction. There's many more explanations, but one that I think is important is that quantum mechanics, the fact that we can't predict when the atom is going to explode, just shows that we have a limited amount of human knowledge. Now, I would favor the last one, but there are other theologians, for example, that favor the first one. Open theology would say that not even God knows what's going to happen in the future. So we have an open future. But again, we have a theory. Everybody's agreed on the theory. The mathematical equations are exactly the same. The predictions are the same, but many different interpretations. The question is, which interpretation is the right interpretation? So the problem is, we have the data, and then we have the theory to explain the data. But how do we make the jump? How do we get from the facts to the theory? So Carl Hempel, the philosopher of science, writes, the transition from data to theory requires creative imagination. So here's where the subjective element comes in. Scientific theories are not derived from observed facts, but are invented in order to account for them. For example, a number of years ago, there was excitement in the newspaper because they had found an Earth-like planet. And the newspaper had said that this planet was certain to have water, which meant that it was certain to have alien life. What's the evidence for that? Well, it turned out that it was all speculation. It was just a trick of the light caused by a magnetic burst from a local star, and there wasn't really a planet there at all. This is something that happens quite often. You look at newspaper reports of some supposed scientific discovery, but if you look at the actual data, you'll find that most of it is just theoretical speculation. So it's important in science to distinguish between the facts and theoretical conclusions that are drawn from that. Emerus Lakatos, another philosopher of science, has written, scientific theories not only equally improvable and equally improbable, but also equally undisprovable. So he says you can never prove a scientific theory because how do you know whether tomorrow some experimental fact is going to come along that will disprove your theory? You can never be sure of that. Secondly, he says a theory is equally improbable because if I have a collection of data, there's an infinite number of theories I could construct to explain the data. So the chances of my particular theory being correct is 1 over infinity, which is 0. And thirdly, he says theories are equally undisprovable because if I want to, I can always keep a favorite theory by changing other theories as well, secondary theories. So for example, the philosopher Quine has written, any statement can be held true, come what may, if we make drastic enough adjustments elsewhere in the system. For example, if I wanted to, I could come up with a theory that the world is flat. And you couldn't disprove that. But the price I pay for that is that I have to make certain changes. Instead of light traveling in straight lines, light travels in circles. In fact, what I can do is I can take the world as we normally look at it, do what we call a mathematical inversion, and transform that onto a plane. So mathematically, the two are equivalents. And which one I want to choose depends on what kind of a metaphysical expectation I have of the universe. So you can keep a particular theory if you want, but you may have to sacrifice other things as well to be able to keep that theory. For example, take Big Bang cosmology. Big Bang cosmology in its original form had certain problems. To solve those problems, the concept of inflation was invented. It was held that very early on in the universe, the particles expanded much faster than the speed of light. But there's no evidence for inflation. It's just a theoretical concept to solve a problem in Big Bang cosmology. Inflation has certain predictions. One was that the universe has a mass much larger than observed. Does that disprove Big Bang cosmology? It doesn't, because to save inflation, it's postulated 95% of the universe was unobservable dark matter. The trouble was that nobody's been able to come up with dark matter in the lab, for example. So there's no good theoretical explanation yet of that. Later, dark energy was invented to explain the fact that the universe now, instead of contracting, you would think that if the universe expands, then the gravitational attraction of the universe is going to make it contract again at some point, but it seems to be going faster and faster away. So it's speculated that there's something called dark energy, which makes particles move away from each other. But again, these aren't found in the lab either. But it shows that with every theory, we can save the theory if we want by coming up with other theories to explain data that doesn't fit into the original version of the theory. So the problem we're faced with is the following. Given that we could explain the data with a number of different theories, what theory should we choose? Some people think, well, take the simplest theory. But then the question is, how do you know that simple theories are more likely to be true than more complicated theories? But the fact is, in life, we would like it to be simple, but life is much more complicated than we like it to be. So again, you may prefer simple theories, but this is a philosophical assumption that you're making. So the problem in science in general is that we have no certain means of separating true theories from false theories. So in practice, we choose theories that fit in best with our worldview, our most basic assumptions about the world. So I'm going to make a distinction between the observational data that we see, and I think we should accept that as fact, and theories that try to explain the facts. So if we look at that, we find that for a theory, it has input from the data. That's objective. From our imagination, subjective. From our worldview, which is subjective as well. So these are three things that go into making a theory. How am I doing so fast? So far, am I going too fast? You can have a copy of this PowerPoint presentation afterwards if you like. A lot of these things I teach in a course. I used to teach in a course, so I've compressed a lot of this into one lecture here. So we're covering a lot of ground. Now, I said that we can accept data as fact, theories as speculative, but even there you have to be careful. We're living in a day of it when there's lots of misinformation and disinformation, so even when you're reading the scientific papers, you have to be careful, because also in scientific papers we find there is a slant. For example, with climate. Are we in danger of global warming or not? It has been much debated. Or COVID, or Corona, as you call it here. what is the factual evidence for that? Do lockups help? Do masks help? You hear different things from different sides. Does vaccination help? So you find that if you want to get something published, if you can show there's a climate emergency, it's easy to get funds from the government. If you're trying to show there's no emergency, it's harder to get funds. So your outcome depends on your funding. And it turns out that a lot of papers are selective. Some time ago, a paper was published that had this graph here, which seems to show that the global warming from 1965 to the 1990s. And this looks quite convincing. So this was published in Nature in 1996. A couple of months later, another paper was published that had this graph here. Same data as the first graph, but you can see that in the first graph, they left out the years before and the years afterwards. And if you look at the entire data, you can see that you get quite a different picture. So the first one is true. Those data points were true, but it's selective. You're leaving out things that go against your theory. So this is a danger that you have in science, that you can be selective. But the temperature data can be fudged. You just choose what fits. Or you can lose evidence, ignore evidence. The editor can be biased as what he's going to accept to be published. There's a very interesting paper written by John Oniadis, where he writes that a randomly chosen scientific paper has less than a 50% chance of being true. This is because they use small sample size, poor study design, researcher bias, and selective reporting. So what I'm saying here is that even with the data, you have to be very careful in science that the data is really there. But the main issue I'm going to look at is the question of worldview. How do we choose scientific theories? So worldview has to do with the question of, does God exist? What exists? What does the world, why does the world exist? What is man? What can we know? What should we do? And what can we hope for? These are all famous philosophical questions, the last three from Immanuel Kant. And how you answer these questions determines what kind of a worldview you have. So the first one has to do with religion, the second with metaphysics, purpose, anthropology, epistemology, ethics, eschatology. So worldview consists, first of all, of presuppositions about how you think the universe fits together, and with a story, a general framework that covers the whole thing. And a worldview serves as spectacles and as a map. So depending on what the framework you have, you're going to look at the world differently. So worldview serves as glasses, if you like. And the thing is that we all have a worldview. We all have glasses. But if you wear glasses long enough, you're not aware anymore that you are wearing glasses. So a lot of people have a worldview but aren't really aware that they have a worldview. They make certain assumptions about worlds that they aren't aware of our assumptions. They just figure it's common sense. And the question is, if you're wearing a worldview that colors everything yellow, if you're wearing yellow glasses, and you meet somebody who has another worldview, who has glasses that make everything appear blue, how can you convince the other person that the world is really yellow and not blue? How can you convince someone that the worldview is wrong? The worldview serves also as a map. So it serves as glasses because we interpret everything we see through our worldview glasses. It serves as a map because a worldview tells us what direction we should go, what decisions we should make, what choices we have. Now, there are different worldviews, and how to convince someone that the worldview is wrong is to look at various aspects. First of all, the worldview should be consistent. You shouldn't have an inconsistent worldview because that will self-destruct. Secondly, a worldview should be consistent with experience. So if you have a worldview that says that you don't have any free will, that you don't make any choices, that your thoughts are just illusions, that doesn't fit with your experience. Because we experience that we do have free will. So we all decided to get up this morning. Okay, we did certain things. We know that we can make choices in life and that we're not just puppets that operate under the laws of chemistry and physics. Thirdly, a worldview should be livable. For example, you could have a worldview saying that language can't convey meaning. So you have professors that write thick books on that language can't convey meaning. But the trouble is, if language can't convey meaning, how can people read your book? So what you're saying is that language, other people's language can't convey meaning, but mine can. You're contradicting yourself. And if you believe that language can't convey meaning, what's going to happen when you drive a car? Are you going to disobey the traffic signs you see or reinterpret them? Or if you have to buy medicine, you want to make sure that you have the right label on your medicine bottle. So if you have the idea that language can't convey meaning, it's an interesting philosophical idea, but you can't live it out in real life. And thirdly, a worldview should be able to explain common sense and science. So the two worldviews I'm going to look at this morning are naturalism on the one side and Christianity on the other side. I choose these two because the authors that I pointed out earlier, Dawkins and the other, are all naturalists. And they're the ones that are saying that God is dead. So let's look at the worldview that they come from. William Provine has written, evolutionary biology tells us there are no purposeful principles in nature, no gods, no designing forces that are rationally detectable. Second, there are no inherent moral or ethical laws. Third, human beings are marvelously complex machines. Fourth, when we die, we die. That's the end of us. There's no hope of everlasting life. Free will does not exist. Evolution can't produce a being that is truly free to make choices. The universe cares nothing for us, and there is no ultimate meaning for humans. So here in a nutshell, you have the essence of naturalism as a worldview. So the story, the thing that ties everything together, is evolution. You start from nothing, it explodes into the Big Bang. You get stars, evolving planets, life, until finally you get the humans. The metaphysics is that you get materialism without purpose, only natural causes. Knowledge, empiricism, okay, there's no divine revelation. Anthropology, man is just an accident. He has no soul. After death, that's it. There's no hope. Ethics, there's no absolute ethical norms. Their religion, God is irrelevant. Now, how well does naturalism work out in practice? It's an interesting book by Roger Penrose. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics last year, I believe. He's written a series of books about physics. They're interesting to read. Penrose says, if I look around, if I think about it carefully, then there's three worlds. First, there's the world of matter. So I look around in this room and I see people and desks. That's the first world. But there's also another world. There's the world of my thoughts. Okay, I have different ideas, different thoughts about the people in the room. And thirdly, some of my thoughts have to do with concepts that seem to be outside my mind. like mathematical concepts or ethical concepts, if you like. There seems to be a world out there dealing with absolutes. So these are ideas, but they're not ideas that come from my mind. They're ideas that seem to be implanted on my mind somehow. So Penrose says that there's three worlds: mind, matter, and math. And there's three mysteries. And the mysteries are, how do you ever get from one world to the other worlds? As Penrose says, if you look at the world of matter, if you look at it closely, you'll find that the physical world is very interesting because you see all kinds of mathematical patterns. I look at this room and I see lots of rectangles, some circles, triangles, but it goes much deeper than that, because if I look, for example, at physics, I have simple mathematical equations like general relativity that can explain a lot of things. It can explain how stars work, how the universe expands. It can explain how billiard balls move. Maxwell's equations explains everything, electricity, magnetism. Schrödinger equation explains all of chemistry. So there's something very neat about these sciences, that just a few mathematical equations can explain a whole wide range of things. So the mathematical nature of the universe goes very deep. And Penrose asked this: it seems to be that the universe is based on these laws, but these laws are abstractions, they're ideas. And how do you ever get from the mathematical world of ideas to the concrete world of matter? It's a huge jump. And secondly, if I look at this ideal world of mathematics, there's many possible worlds, many possible mathematical equations that I could write. So what is it that chooses one particular form and makes that concrete into the physical world? That's the first mystery. How do you get from math to mind? Second mystery is, if you start with matter, matter evolves. How do you ever get to mind? Because matter consists of atoms, but mind consists of ideas. So to get from an atom to the idea of an atom is quite a different jump. And if you're looking at evolution, how do you ever get that? It seems to be a jump that you can't make. Nobody has been able to get from matter to consciousness. It's one of the deep mysteries that we have in science. And the final mystery he has is, okay, so we have a mind. My mind, my consciousness absorbs things from the material world. But somehow my mind also has access to this mathematical world of eternal truths. How is that possible? How can mathematical ideas be imprinted upon my mind? How can I have access to that particular world? So Penrose has no solution. And his final position is that the real world is the mathematical world. He's a Platonist, so he believes the real world is the ideal world up there. The physical world is the shadow of it, and so is my mind. Dawkins would say, no, the real world is the material world. And that my mind is just an illusion, and so is the mathematical world. Of course, from a Christian point of view, we would say, well, God has created the world according to a rational plan, so we can expect to see a mathematical pattern. God has created man in the image of God, which includes rationality, so man can distinguish between that plan. And so from a Christian point of view, we can see how everything fits together. So the naturalist says the material world is the first world. Everything starts from there. Christian worldview says, no, the first thing is mind, if you like. In the beginning was the Word. It's God. It's the ultimate reality. And from there, we can explain things. So the problem with naturalism also is that mathematics works very well V mathematics, for physics. So if science is true, and if science is based on this mathematical equation, it suggests that somehow math must be true as well. But then how does math fit in? The philosopher Quine has written, naturalism entails that scientific theories are generally true, particularly in physics. But theories in physics refer to mathematical objects, numbers, vectors, functions, and so on. So if scientific theories are true, that means that mathematical objects must exist. And if they must exist, where do they exist? Augustine held that mathematical ideas exist in the mind of God, and God upholds mathematics. And as long as mathematicians believed in God, they believed that they were discovering mathematical truth, that they were discovering parts of the mind of God, as it were. Once you don't believe in God anymore, there's no place to put these mathematical truths, and there's no, if there was a place, there's no means to access those truths. Einstein too writes, how can it be that math, if it's a product of human thought, independent of experience, how is it that it applies so well to the objects of reality? A big issue in mathematics is mathematics something that you discover, or is it something that you invent? So the theist can believe that's something you discover. Mathematics is in the mind of God. If you don't believe in God, you have to believe that mathematics is a human invention. But if it's something that we invent, how is it that it works so well in reality? So naturalism has a number of problems. How do you get from math to matter? From matter to mind? From mind to math? And we'll see also that it has a problem of self-refutation. First of all, going from math to matter, we get some interesting questions. Why does the universe exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does it have order and uniformity? It could be chaotic. Why is it mathematically intelligible? Why does it have a particular mathematical form? And how are these mathematical forms actualized? And once you get to matter, how do you get to mind? The problem here is, how can purposeless matter produce purposeful life? Because life is quite distinct from matter. If you look at the simplest cell, it's very complicated. I'll have a picture of that later on. But even if you have all the parts in place, how do you get it to actually work? How can chance produce complexity? How did information arise? Information seems to be related to purpose, to purposeful being. DNA is full of information. So how did DNA arise in the first place? One of the deepest problems in science is, how can matter become conscious? Where does consciousness come from? Your brain consists of millions of neurons with billions of different connections. And how is it that if our brain consists of all of these different parts, that we have this strong sense of the self? I consider myself to be one being, not a whole bunch of different things operating together. And how do thoughts influence the brain? The brain, from a biological point of view, seems to work according to the laws of chemistry and physics. And yet, my mind operates according to the laws of rationality, of morality, of logic. My mind operates according to what ought to be. My brain operates according to what is. So how can mind and brain be connected together? And what transforms mental choice to physical action? And if mind is something that evolved from matter, why should we trust our minds? Why should our thoughts be true? How can non-physical absolutes exist? How can is produce ought? And how do we access eternal norms? So these are all interesting questions that are hard to address from a naturalist point of view. Darwin himself wrote that if my mind has been developed from that of a monkey, how can I trust it? Would anyone trust in the conviction of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions of such a mind? VU another Nobel Prize winner in physics, wrote, it's hard to believe that a reasoning power is brought by Darwin's natural process of selection to the perfection it seems to possess. Natural selection is geared towards useful beliefs, survival of the fittest, not true beliefs. So if evolution is blind, then why should our beliefs be true? Now you may argue that a belief has to be true in order to be useful. So the next question is, if our beliefs are true, why is our belief in God not true? Because most people believe in a God, a supernatural being at some point. It seems to be a natural thing to believe. So if our beliefs are true, we should believe that one as well. But the biggest problem that naturalism faces is that it self-refutes itself. Stephen Hawking again writes, it's hard to imagine how free will can operate if our behaviors are determined by physical laws. So it seems that we are no more than biological machines and that free will is just an illusion. Sir Francis Crick, who discovered the DNA, writes, he has a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis. He says, the astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories and ambitions, are all in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells. So the result of naturalism, of materialism, is that your thoughts, your free will just become illusions. The same thing applies to morality. Michael Ruse has written, morality, or more strictly our belief in morality, is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. Ethics is an illusion fought too often us by our genes to get us to cooperate. Ethics is produced by evolution, but it's not justified by it. Now, if that's the case, if we have no free will, have no control over what we do, why should we punish crime? Philosopher Derek Peterbohm has written, given our best scientific theories, factors beyond our control ultimately produce all our actions. We are therefore not morally responsible for them. So he suggests that when judges punish criminals, they should be aware of the fact that criminals couldn't help what they did, so they should be lean in giving out punishment. The trouble with that is that if criminals can't help what they do, judges can't help what they do either. So again, by writing this, he's saying, on the one hand, he's saying we don't have any free will, we can't help what we do, so we shouldn't punish criminals. On the other hand, he's writing this book where he's saying you should change your mind about how you change criminals. So it's self-refuting, because if his theory is true, then we can't change our minds, and there's no point in reading his book. If I want to have a discussion with somebody else, if I want to convince him that my theory, that my worldview is correct, I have to assume that there's a purposeful knower, that we have a reliable mind and senses, that I can hear what you're saying, that there's a logic, objective truth, that there's absolute rational values, mental causation, objective language. But all of these things are things that naturalism says don't really exist. So that means that if I try to argue for naturalism, I'm refuting myself, because I'm assuming that naturalism is false to argue that naturalism is true. And the same thing holds for science. For science, we assume, in addition to norms for rational discourse, that we have an orderly universe, that nature is uniform, that math is applicable, that we have objective values needed to do science. None of these fit in very well with naturalism, which means that naturalism can't really account for science and for scientists. Finally, if we look at the purpose of life, we have provided, naturalist writes, there's no ultimate meaning for humans. Dawkins writes, we are machines built by DNA whose purpose is to make more copies of itself. It's every living object's sole reason for living. Now you have to ask yourself, if our only purpose to live is to make more copies of ourselves, why is Dawkins writing this? He should be home with his wife making more copies of himself, not giving lectures on naturalism. So again, by writing this, he's self-repeating himself. And remember earlier Dawkins said, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. But if you follow Dawkins through, then the price he pays is that the intellect becomes just a meaningless illusion. So again, naturalism just doesn't fit together. Now, why are we here? A much better answer is given by the Westminster Confession, for example, that man is here, man's sole purpose is to glorify God and to serve him forever. So let me spend some time looking at the basis of the Christian worldview. So the story that ties it together is that God has a plan for the universe. This plan consists of the creation of the universe, the fall into sin of man, and redemption through the work of Jesus Christ. The metaphysics is that God is the ultimate reality. Knowledge from divine revelation, some of it may be innate, also from the senses. Anthropology, man is created in God's image to serve him. Man consists not just of a material body, but also of an immaterial soul. And that there are absolutes in mathematics, logic, also in ethics and morality, and these absolutes are set by God. So a Christian view of knowledge that you find back in Augustine is that God is the ultimate reality, that God creates the physical universe, upholds it from one moment to the next. God has revealed truth to us through his divine revelation, the Bible. God also upholds mathematics and logic. On the other hand, scientific theories are fallible human inventions that should agree with observation, with logic, and with the Bible. So there are certain constraints that we have on science. Now, although man is a fallen image of God, he still bears the image of God to some extent, and this includes rationality and the ability to know. And the question is, to what extent can we learn from unbelievers? Unbelievers can make useful advances. In the Bible, for example, it's the unbelievers that first made tents, music, and technology. On the other hand, Paul warns against false knowledge, which may destroy faith. He contrasts God's foolishness against worldly wisdom. And he says that we must test the spirit to see if they come from God. So the Bible is our ultimate standard of truth. So common grace, it should be balanced, if you like, by the antithesis. Okay, both of these terms, if you like, come from Abraham Kuyper, who originated this university back in 1880. It's written much about them. So the antithesis has to do with the global conflict between belief and unbelief, between Christian and non-Christian worldviews. The worldview is either God glorifying or God denying. So the main issue, does the Bible reveal truth or not? So it's God's word against Satan's deception. Now that's out of the Lord against, did God really say that? The first question in the Bible. And it dates back to Genesis 3 verse 15. I will put enmity between Satan's seed and her seed. So Adam Kuyper wrote that it's not a question of faith against science. He says, but actually we got two scientific systems, two scientific elaborations opposed to each other, each having its own faith. It's not a question of science against Christianity, he says, but it's a question of whether we're going to have a naturalistic view of science or a Christian view of science. So that's why he started this university, so that each discipline could be taught from a Christian perspective. Now, C.S. Lewis has written much of the same. He says there's no neutral ground in the universe. Every square inch, every split second is claimed by God and counterclaimed by Satan. So Kuyper says that Christians should set up their own science. They shouldn't just blindly find naturalistic science, but they should do science in a different way. So this difference would show itself first of all in metaphysics. What exists? Okay, we believe that the physical world that we see. But just a few days ago, you had a holiday here, right? Ascension Day. We celebrate the fact that Jesus Christ went up with his body to heaven. Most people don't believe that heaven exists anymore, but as Christians we believe that there is another universe there, other part of the universe, a physical place, because Christ there is physical body, which interacts with the physical universe that we see. So it's almost, if you like, that the universe is four-dimensional. We've got three-dimensional universe that we live in. There's another universe, three-dimensional universe in heaven, and somehow the two can connect with each other. So that's one difference that we have to look past what we see to look at the heaven, the place of God, the departed saints, and angels that also exists. And that means that if you look at causes, there can be natural causes, but there can also be supernatural causes. Epistemology, that means that there's senses, there's reason, but there's also divine revelation. There's different views on purpose, ethics, and values, different views on history. Christians will see all history as the unfolding of God's plan. Different views of the future. Okay, we don't believe that life for us ends when we die. We believe that our soul lives on and becomes reunited with our body when Christ returns. That'll be the day of judgment, and then we'll live in a renewed heaven and earth. So these are all ways in which a Christian science would differ quite drastically from a naturalist science. Now it's interesting that if we look at science that we have now, if you look at its background, it originated from a Christian worldview. And this dates back to Genesis, where man was told to subdue and replenish the earth, cultural mandates. The cultural mandate provided motivation to study God's creation. Belief in a rational God, whom man imaged, made science feasible. And it's no coincidence that the scientific revolution took place pretty well at the same time of the Reformation as well. So if you look at the earlier scientists, you'll find that they're almost all Christians. Francis Bacon, for example, looks at the universe as the works of God. So does Johannes Kepler, Galileo, Isaac Newton. Okay, they all believed that the universe was created by God and that it had a purpose and that it showed evidence of design. This brings us to the question of the two books. Quite often it's asked, well, doesn't God reveal truth also in nature? And since God is the author of both nature and the Bible, should we interpret the Bible in line with science? Isn't all truth God's truth? Some books have that title, All Truth is God's Truth. It's a dangerous thought, though, because the question is, how do you know something is true unless you already know the truth beforehand? So, for example, the Bible does point towards a natural theology to some extent. It says, for what can be known about God is plain, because God has shown it to them, for his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived in things that have been made. So if you look around you, you see a beautiful flower, butterfly, seed. If you look at that, you'll be struck by, yeah, there must be a creator behind it who made this. Particularly because Romans says that no one is without excuse. So that means you don't have to be a scientist to see this design. It's something that strikes even a child as being self-evident. But if you look at the simplest cells, you'll find it's amazingly complex. And if you take this one part away, the whole thing won't work. You won't be able to reproduce, you don't have life. So certainly if you look at the cell, you'll be struck by how amazing it is. There's a famous atheist philosopher, Anthony Flew, an Australian, who by looking at the cell came to the conclusion that life must be designed. He found it was impossible that this would arise by chance. So through nature, he was convinced that there was a designer, but he never moved beyond that. He never became a Christian. So nature can convince you maybe that there is a creator, but to become a Christian, it takes more than just nature. Now, quite often, the Christians talk about the book of nature. We have to be careful not to confuse nature with naturalistic science. For one thing, the Bible says that general revelation reveals only God's power and divinity. Second, God's written word is clear and for. It deals with ideas, if you like, whereas general revelation just reveals pictures. So nature is a picture book. It shows you, gives you a snapshot of what exists. You can watch it for a while and see certain processes as they work, but it tells you what is. It doesn't tell you what ought to be. So you can't get ethical or moral norms from nature. Fourth, the message of the book of nature is obvious. And you have to remember that when we look at nature, we're looking at nature right now. We're looking at the page it does with the year 2023. Nature doesn't tell us what happened 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. For that, we have to go from the present data to make a theoretical extrapolation back into the past. The sixth, don't confuse what you see of nature with scientific interpretation or extrapolation. Again, there's a distinction here between the facts, what you see, and scientific theory that tries to explain or extend the facts. The seventh, the Bible stresses the limitation of human reasoning with origins. For example, in Job, God asked Job at the end, where were you when I created everything? Who are you to complain? Who are you to criticize me? It's a physicist called Paul Davies who's written a lot of interesting books about science from a non-mathematical point of view. So they're interesting for the person that isn't science. But he writes, for 300 years, science has based itself on materialism, leading inevitably to atheism and the meaningless of physical existence. But he says even the most atheistic scientist accepts as an act of faith that the universe is not observed, and that there is a rational basis to physical existence. So science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview. Interesting conclusion. Because even many naturalists realize that their position has difficulties. Thomas Nagel is an interesting philosopher. He's written a book called Mind and Cosmos. There he writes why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. So materialism cannot accommodate consciousness. So it must have been a purely materialistic view of nature. Minds are features of biological systems, and standard material evolutionary biology is incomplete. So what he's saying here is that we need more than matter to explain the complete universe, to explain consciousness as well as material. Richard Lewontin, a naturalist biologist, writes, we take the side of materialism in spite of the absurdity of some of its constructs because we have a prior commitment to materialism. We are forced by our adherence to material causes to create a set of concepts that would produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive. That material is absolute, for we cannot allow divine foot in the door. So what he's saying is that materialism leads to the idea that you don't have free will, that your thought's an illusion, which seems silly, but if we don't go that direction, then we have to allow for God to interfere. John Searle says the same thing. He says, how can so many philosophers and scientists say so many things that seem obviously false? For example, most philosophers of mind say that you have no mind, that your mind is just an illusion. But he continues, acceptance of the current view is motivated not so much by an independent conviction of the truth as by a terror of what are apparently the only alternatives. So the choices between a scientific approach, materialism, and what he calls an anti-scientific approach, which has to do with the religious conception of the mind. And Nagel again writes, I'm talking about the fear of religion. I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. But he said, this isn't just that I don't believe in God. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. My guess is that this cosmic authority problem is responsible for much of the scientism of our time. Supports a ludicrous overuse of evolutionary biology to explain everything about life, including the human mind. What he's saying is that I don't want there to be a God, because if there's a God, that means that I'll be held accountable to God for what I do. I don't want to be held accountable to God. I want to be able to do what I want to do without being judged. So is God dead? The idea was written about by Nietzsche. He says God is dead, we have killed him, science has killed him. But Nietzsche also went on to say that science has killed truth. Because Nietzsche argued once God is dead, then there's no longer any basis for absolute truth. And that means then that man doesn't have anything to hold on to. So human reason starts to criticize things, but ultimately it criticizes itself. And once human reason starts to criticize itself, it self-destructs, because it realizes that it has no basis for its own existence. So Jean-Paul Sartre has written, atheistic existentialism states that if God does not exist, man is only what he makes of himself. It's very distressing that God does not exist, because all possibilities of finding values disappear so long with God. Hence man is forlorn, there is nothing within him nor without to cling to. So he rejects God, but then he finds he doesn't have anything left. Bertrand Russell comes to the same conclusion. The center of me is always in eternal pain. He's trying to search for something that he can't find. He knows that there's something out there. He's looking for truth, but he just can't find it. So it's like Augustine wrote about, he said the soul finds no rest until it finds its rest in God. Or Pascal wrote that man has a God-shaped hole or void that only God can fill. So both these philosophers say that God has created man in such a way that man needs fellowship with God. And if he rejects God, he's left with this longing for the fellowship that he can't fill. He tries to find it elsewhere, but he can't find it, and he ends up being very much depressed by it. I'm going to sum up. Did science kill God? Well, there's no proof that science can explain everything, or that belief of God is irrational. Science is objective. It needs a viable worldview. Worldview is the basic presuppositions. The defense of materialism, I argue, is self-defeating, ultimately. Okay, there's no human free will, no thought, no truth, no rationality, no morality. There's no place for scientists or for science. And that Christianity, on the other hand, gives coherence. It gives meaning, purpose, and hope. And that Christianity provides a solid basis for science. So finally, I want to leave you with a challenge. The challenge for all students is to articulate your worldview. What are your most basic beliefs, your values, and priorities? And then to work it out consistently. So worldviews come in package deals. The worldview is an all-encompassing system. So as Christians, we should be careful not to mix Christianity with another worldview, because if you do that, you produce an inconsistency that will eventually undermine your Christian commitment. So the world may think that you're a fool if you're a Christian, but since they will consider you to be a fool anyways, you may as well be a consistent fool and go entirely with your Christian worldview rather than try to compromise it. We've covered a lot of ground. You've been very patient, and thank you for listening to me.